So the hot topic, Jody, right now is the ransomware attack on the Texas Supreme Court and Court of Appeals websites. Um, we could, I'm sure, talk for way longer than 30 minutes on that topic, but I figured we would chat today about that. As I mentioned at the outset, um, Tames, I will tell you, I knew I used Tames a lot in my practice to access information over the internet through the court dockets and so forth, but I felt pretty paralyzed in the last 2 weeks. What about you?
Yeah, if I were gonna pick a playlist for the ransomware, I think you picked A Fine Time to Leave Me, Lucille by Kenny Rogers, and You Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone by Cinderella. Because I mean, seriously, I bragged and bragged for the first 2 months of quarantine that I could do whatever I wanted to do from home, and gosh, it's so great and everything's so accessible. And then Tames went down, and it turns out that I feel like about 50% of what I do somehow involves Tames on a daily basis because I'll go to log in to do something and then, oops, that doesn't work. And I just have to remember it.
Yeah, that's right. I was kind of in the same boat. I mean, I am on the sites all the time. I'm constantly getting, I'm downloading, records from the attorney portal, which is tied into that system. Case mail, is
Mhm.
related to that system, and so and the regular opinions and orders lists coming out of all the courts, not just the Supreme Court. I mean, it's a habit for me when I sit down at my computer in the morning. One of the first things I do is check and see what the Third Court of Appeals is doing that day, and
Yep.
I have felt. I'm not ashamed to say I felt just discombobulated in the last 2 weeks.
I totally agree. I mean, thankfully, they've started pushing out some of the orders from the courts on the new txcourts.net site. But, one of my favorite things, and I think this says a lot about me, unfortunately, one of my favorite things to do always has been on Thursdays to go to the court that released on Thursdays and on Fridays to go to the courts that released there and kind of click through and see what opinions were coming out and who the counsel were and look at the briefing and kind of see what the issues were. And I miss that as much as that says about me, unfortunately. But
I think it just says that you're a dedicated appellate lawyer because that sounds completely normal.
yeah, I think I feel that way and my coworkers feel that way. But other people probably sounds kind of weird. But I think the listeners and the podcast will sympathize with that.
Right. And so, I mean, if anyone who's listening now doesn't know, on May the 8th, that morning, uh, the the txcourts.gov site, which is the parent site for basically OCA, created these sites for all the Texas appellate courts, got attacked by a ransomware virus. I've heard it called the second wave virus because we've been dealing with enough of a hardship with the coronavirus situation, and now this hits. But literally, we didn't know. This was the day that we recorded the episode with David Slayton that this happened. And we didn't know, other than the fact that the sites were down and that we didn't get Supreme Court orders on Friday the same way that we usually would, what was going on. All we knew that the sites were down. And then within a couple of days, OCA issued a release saying, yeah, we got hit with ransomware and we're not paying the ransom. We haven't lost any data. That's been the big saving grace in all this, is everyone should be assured that all the courts are saying that there has been no data loss in all of this. And in fact, as we're recording this episode, the sites are starting to come back up. I received some notifications from the third court site today, actually doing things like, giving me the file stamp copies of my motions that were filed back around the 12th or 13th, and then also ruling on some extension requests related to those same filings. So, everyone should be assured that the court sites are backed up. In addition to what OCA was doing, I know that the Supreme Court Clerk's Office had some internal backups there, and that's one of the ways that txcourts.net site was created, was by restoring some data that was already available.
Well, and that site has been really useful because you can at least get some of the orders that are coming out of the courts. You can get the opinions that are coming out piece by piece. They're starting to trickle in, I think, from almost all the courts, it looks like. And then I know the Fifth Court has its own backup site, that the old courtstuff.net site that was around forever before they fully standardized onto the Thames system. So there are still ways to access that stuff now. And it seems like it's all getting a little bit more standardized.
Right. You mentioned court stuff. It brought back memories for me to see that URL being used, because I started my career as a younger lawyer in Dallas, and that was, pre-Thames. And
Oh, yeah.
so, the Fifth Court of Appeals in Dallas was ahead of its time in getting that site prepared and posting orders and everything. It was really a precursor of sorts to Thames in our current system. And I think, honestly, it's kind of a funny part of this. I think the Fifth Court kind of reluctantly gave way to Thames, because it had a pretty strong following and was pretty used to the way it did things. But the Supreme Court said mandatory e-filing means use our system, and now, of course, everything is up until now has gone swimmingly with that.
It has. The things that I think have been more difficult is once you get used to getting the automated case mail in all the cases where you get your notifications of things that were filed, of rulings from the court and all that. I kind of miss it because, the last couple of weeks you file something and you may or may not get the actual file stamp copy. You get your file stamp copy, you get your notices, and you haven't really gotten those in a couple of weeks. And so it's been a little bit hard to just kind of push something out there and hope that it lands, or get a notice from the court and not know what's out there. And when you're used to getting instantaneous notices, it really does make it hard to not.
Oh, that's right. I mean, I was used to getting confirmation of my submission, which actually still has been happening. Thankfully, this did not affect eFile Texas. But then, most of the courts are pretty good about turning around your filings reasonably quickly, if not within, an hour or even two, certainly the next business day. Especially if it was a late afternoon filing. And then suddenly, my initial take on all this was that the intermediate appellate courts had become basically black holes. I was submitting things, but nothing was coming out. And
I think that's right.
I felt a little guilty for using that terminology a little bit later, because I didn't mean to imply that the courts weren't doing work. I think they were just as paralyzed as we were. And from everything I've heard, the justices didn't have access to Thames either. They couldn't get, the only thing they had available to them was documents that they already had pulled down in some other fashion. And so it's been an extreme challenge, I think, for the courts to put out any meaningful work over this time. The Supreme Court set up basically a whole alternative system, relying largely on not only this txcourts.net site, but also, I mean, we've heard even more than usual from Blake Hawthorne and the Supreme Court Twitter account, aside from Blake's personal Twitter account. And then the court, one thing that Blake pointed out really early on was that documents that were submitted over the e-filing system are automatically loaded into the Research Texas system. So in theory, one should be able to, if documents are submitted, should be able to pull up the docket for that case on Research Texas and have everything there available. And I think that was one of the things that the Supreme Court used to cobble together a temporary system that has, I think, with the Supreme Court has done pretty well with keeping things moving. I don't think that court's missed too much of a beat, but we're having a much bigger challenge with the intermediate courts of appeals, I'm afraid.
Well, and it's a lot harder for them because they don't have the same kind of docket that the Supreme Court does either. So many of them are original proceedings, accelerated proceedings, all that stuff. And, in addition to just the regular steady flow of cases that they can't just say pet denied on. So I can only imagine the surge of things that have hit them in addition to all this. Plus, a lot of them were doing remote work anyway and trying to transition to that, which is already a whole other challenge.
That's true. I mean, the Supreme Court has no criminal jurisdiction, and then discretionary jurisdiction. And although it's getting its cases come from 14 intermediate courts, if you just look at the docket numbers in the Supreme Court, usually on any given year, there's about 100 or maybe 120 matters filed of all kinds. And the courts of appeals, the volume in those courts is much, much different. Plus they're getting not only all the civil cases, but also, all the criminal cases too. And so that is a much different level of activity in the clerk's offices. And with Thames being down, nothing coming in, you're seeing, kind of just an unreal backlog of stuff happening. But, the courts have started to come through it. And now, as I understand it, just today, recently the txcourts.gov sites have started to be rebuilt. Some limited version of them is currently available online. I think it consists largely of just backup data. I don't know that anything new has really been added yet, but it's at least going back to the point where those sites were backed up. And then new information, OCA and David Slayton's folks are working round the clock to get the information up to date. And it's just going to take a while for this process to play out.
Yeah. In fact, I know a couple of attorneys who had oral arguments scheduled either this week or the next week that got canceled because the courts just simply couldn't get to the materials they needed to prepare. And, one of those things that you don't think about, even though the website's down, you think you'd be able to have oral argument, but if the court can't get to all the things they need, then it's not going to be helpful to anybody.
That's right. And, in the face of coronavirus, all the courts were doing a good job of pivoting and making scheduling oral argument through Zoom. The Supreme Court got a lot of attention on a national basis for getting Zoom arguments kicked off, and had one even, I believe it was yesterday, on the voting by mail issue. And, but yeah, it was able to move forward with that because it had this other system in place where, it could communicate with the lawyers. And my understanding is that they're actually working out the kinks pretty well so that the Zoom arguments are going pretty smoothly now. No technical difficulties like what David Slayton told us about when he was on the show.
Yeah, it seems like it. I've watched some at the Supreme Court and I've watched a couple at the intermediate courts, and they seem like they all go off pretty well. Now I know there's a lot of behind the scenes work that gets into that, but from the viewer perspective, just watching it on the YouTube channel, they go off pretty seamlessly.
It is kind of interesting that around the time the courts really kind of get up and running on Zoom, I mean, they're having their conferences over Zoom. They're starting to have oral arguments over Zoom, and then this hits, the ransomware hits, and it's just a whole nother level of paralysis. But I want to say, I know how hard that all those folks have been working. And I know, OCA has been just going crazy trying to get this resolved. The folks in the Supreme Court and other clerks' offices are doing their very best. We're in good hands. This would have been a disaster had there been a data loss. One thing I was reminded of was that the Supreme Court went back, 20 years or so, I think, and put old data online, old court orders and things that, I don't know, if those documents still exist. So it could have really been tragic, but of course our folks planned ahead and executed the plan. And so we're not in any danger of losing information. It's what we're dealing with is really, sadly, just more of an inconvenience than anything.
It is. It's just one of those things that I think feels that much more acute now that we're all, doing stay-at-home orders for coronavirus. If I were in the office, it probably wouldn't seem quite as extreme as it does when this is kind of the only thing that you do during the day from your computer at home.
Right. I am seeing, though, one question I kind of threw out to Twitter about a week ago or so was, we were in this black hole situation, and the documents weren't as freely available for those coming out of the intermediate courts of appeals as they have been for the Supreme Court. And so the thought kind of formed in my mind that, maybe there needs to be some kind of a blanket order extending some deadlines, because I know for me, I was having an issue getting a reporter's record in a case where I've got a filing deadline. It's a time sensitive set deadline that the 14th court set for me for 4 p.m. tomorrow. And I couldn't get on the attorney portal to download the record, even though the court reporter supposedly filed it. I wasn't getting it despite several requests from my opposing counsel. It turns out later it was even the third layer of problem was, I had my virus scanner on my incoming email software was a little hyper aggressive and actually blocked the opposing counsel's request or his effort rather to send this stuff to me. So fortunately I didn't accuse him of anything nefarious. But that was, that was when I realized just how dependent I am on these systems being up and running, with 99.9% uptime or whatever they are. I was sitting around, couldn't get my hands on this record no matter what I did. And so now I'm kind of scrambling a little bit to get this response in. But, the technology, we all depend on it. Mm-hmm. And when it goes down, it's a big deal. But here, I don't know what the source of the ransomware attack was. If it was someone who clicked on something that they shouldn't have, that's kind of the classic MO, I think. And I'm certainly not pointing any fingers. I mean, this kind of thing is going to happen. And I understand it now too. There's been another attack on maybe is it DPS? I don't know if you've heard about that, Jerry.
Yeah, there's some other government agency. I don't remember what it was, but you're right.
So the bad guys are trying to exploit the situation that we're all in. So
don't click on any unknown podcast emails. We don't want our new website to get locked up.
But we don't spam our listeners either. So
well, that's also true. That's true. We try not to.
But the point I was coming to on the blanket orders was we're now starting to see some blanket orders coming out of the intermediate courts of appeals. Mm-hmm. On the 19th, the 1st and 14th granted a blanket extension for every case in which there is an appellate briefing deadline. Ordinary appeals, not child custody, not juvenile, one or two other exceptions. But there has been the perceived, there's been the perception that this is a significant enough issue that some of these courts are taking it upon themselves to issue these blanket orders and help practitioners out who might have been in a similar situation to what I was experiencing earlier this week, not being able to download an appellate record to start a brief, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think right now what we've got on those is the 1st and 14th courts in Houston, the 6th court, I believe, and the 11th.
Texarkana.
Yeah, and the 11th in Eastland.
Yep, I saw those come down yesterday.
And I kind of thought that we'd see them from pretty much all the courts, but the indications are now that may not be happening.
And it may be that they're just kind of handling it on an as-needed basis.
Yeah, I think so. I think you could make the case either way. I mean, it'd be nice if all the courts were handling it the same, kind of like when the Supreme Court first issued the emergency orders that said, the trial judges may extend limitations. Mm-hmm. And there was a little bit of a backlash about that. Folks saying, well, wait a minute, where my case is shouldn't determine what my statute of limitations is. And so the Supreme Court went back and fixed that. And I don't know that that's going to happen here because, being in appellate courts, this is a little different situation. I mean, you have longer term deadlines. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's being said, it may not be necessary, even though it's nice to have these blanket orders. In defense of those courts that haven't put one out yet and may not, it may not be necessary. The courts are saying, extensions are going to be freely granted. Mm-hmm. And so if anyone has a situation where they need an extension, the remedy is still there. It's not like you're going to be, out of luck.
Well, and that's been my experience really since we started the whole stay-at-home thing is courts have been very forgiving on extensions and very understanding. Number one, by kind of the issues that are imposed by having to work from home for so many people. So if anything, I think this will just make them even a little bit more liberal with what was already a pretty easy process, and that the standards of appellate conduct already require, agreement without any real good reason to oppose it. And there's not a whole lot of good reasons out there in a regular civil appeal anyway.
I can't think of one. I am loath to ever even consider opposing an extension, but right now I couldn't imagine a situation in which I would oppose one.
Yeah, it has to be a real prejudice to your client for some reason.